19-year-old Talia had been living in fear for years. Her stepfather, Mark, was a man with a temper, controlling and abusive behind closed doors. The tension in their home was something no one outside really knew about. But one night, everything reached a breaking point. Mark's anger turned violent, and Talia, terrified and cornered, fought back. By the time it was over, Mark lay dead, and Talia was left to face the aftermath. She told the police that a home intruder was responsible. But as the investigation began, details of Talia's life under Mark's control started to surface. Officer Kim, the lead investigator, quickly realized something didn't add up. Talia's mother, Janet, was in shock, struggling to accept what had happened. But more than that, she was forced to face the reality of the abuse Talia had endured for so long. This story takes us inside a home filled with secrets and fear, leading to a deadly confrontation. Was it truly self-defense, or was there more to the story than anyone could see? Keep watching as we uncover the full story of Talia's fight for survival and the tragic end that changed everything. It was a quiet night in the suburbs when the police received a distress call. A young woman named Sarah, barely in her early 20s, had reported a home invasion. She claimed that an unknown intruder had broken into her house and attacked her stepfather, John, in a violent confrontation that ended with John's death. Sarah was in shock, shaken to her core, as she recounted the terrifying details of that night. From the surface, it seemed like an open and shut case of a home defense gone wrong. However, things weren't as simple as they seemed. John had a long-standing reputation in the neighborhood. To the public, he appeared to be a regular family man, but within the walls of their home, a different story unfolded. Neighbors had noticed the occasional heated arguments, but no one could have predicted what truly went on behind closed doors. Sarah's mother, who had married John when Sarah was a teenager, had often been seen with bruises. Though she made excuses, there was an underlying tension between John and Sarah that made their home anything but peaceful. As the investigation started, the first responders found Sarah in a state of emotional breakdown, standing over her stepfather's lifeless body. She insisted it was self-defense, that the masked intruder had attacked John and she had no choice but to fight back. The crime scene, however, didn't quite add up. There were no signs of forced entry, and the way John's body was positioned raised immediate suspicions. The knife used in the attack, a kitchen knife from their own home, had Sarah's fingerprints all over it. Detective Mason, a seasoned officer with a history of handling violent domestic cases, took charge of the investigation. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about Sarah's story. While it was not uncommon for victims of domestic violence to snap under pressure, the conflicting details in Sarah's account left room for doubt. John's body showed signs of a struggle, but it wasn't the kind of fight that typically resulted from an unexpected intruder. Sarah's mother, Laura, was away on a trip at the time, leaving Sarah and John alone in the house. Neighbors reported hearing shouting earlier that evening, but no one had thought to call the police until it was too late. This lack of witness testimony added another layer of mystery to the case. What really happened between Sarah and John that night? Was it truly an act of self-defense, or was there something far more sinister at play? As the police gathered evidence, they uncovered a chilling backstory. John had a history of abuse that stretched back years, something Sarah had tried to shield from the world. Friends recalled how Sarah would avoid talking about her home life, often dismissing concerns with vague explanations. However, the more the detectives dug into the past, the more they realized that this wasn't a one-off incident. Sarah had been living in fear for years, trapped in a toxic relationship with a stepfather who had made her life unbearable. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Sarah had reached her breaking point. The years of emotional and physical abuse had pushed her to the edge, and when John had finally crossed the line, she acted out of desperation. Yet Sarah's claim that it was an intruder didn't match up with the evidence. Why lie about something that could potentially be seen as justifiable self-defense? As the detectives pieced together the events leading up to the night of the murder, they realized that Sarah might have planned her escape long before the incident occurred. Text messages, hidden journal entries, and a conversation with a close friend painted a picture of a young woman who was preparing to take drastic measures. The question remained, was Sarah's act purely out of self-defense, or had she seen no other way out of her dire situation? This was no longer just a case of a home invasion gone wrong. It was becoming clear that Sarah had been fighting for her survival long before the night John died. With the case still unfolding, the detectives prepared for the deeper revelations that were about to come. As they headed into the investigation, one thing was certain: the truth was far more complicated than it first appeared. As the investigation into John's death progressed, The detectives began piecing together more details about the family's life behind closed doors. They interviewed neighbors, friends, and anyone who had been close to John, Laura, and Sarah. Everyone had something to say, but the picture that emerged was far from simple. John had been known for his temper, but there had been little evidence of abuse outside the household. Most of the neighbors thought of him as a stern but hard-working man. What they didn't know was that behind closed doors he ruled the house with an iron fist. Sarah's mother, Laura, who was out of town at the time of the incident, returned as soon as she got the news of her husband's death. She was devastated and in shock. She couldn't believe that her husband was gone, but even more, she was struggling to grasp the fact that her own daughter had been involved. The police interrogated her about John's behavior and the family dynamic. At first, Laura was hesitant, almost defensive, but as the detectives pressed on, cracks in her facade began to show. Laura revealed that John had indeed been abusive. He was controlling and violent, but she never thought things would escalate to such a tragic end. She spoke of Sarah's fear of John, how she had tried to keep the peace in the house for years, always walking on eggshells around her stepfather. Laura admitted that she had turned a blind eye to the abuse, hoping it would eventually stop, but it never did. She blamed herself for not stepping in sooner to protect her daughter, but she couldn't have imagined it would lead to this. With Laura's testimony, the detectives began to understand Sarah's desperation. It became clear that Sarah had been living in fear for a long time, trapped in a toxic household where escape seemed impossible. But even with this information, the details surrounding John's death still didn't add up. If Sarah had acted in self-defense, why hadn't she called the police sooner? Why did she claim it was an intruder when all the evidence pointed to her? The more they questioned Sarah, the more her story began to unravel. Her initial claim about the intruder seemed less believable as she contradicted herself in multiple statements. She was clearly traumatized, but her inability to provide a consistent account raised red flags. The detectives began to suspect that Sarah might not be telling the full truth, that perhaps there was more to the story than a simple case of self-defense. As the investigation continued, the forensic team found more evidence that contradicted Sarah's version of events. There were no signs of forced entry, and the struggle between Sarah and John appeared to have occurred in the kitchen. The knife that had killed John was found next to his body, and Sarah's fingerprints were all over it. But what struck the investigators as odd was the lack of defensive wounds on Sarah. If there had been an intruder or a struggle with John, she should have had more injuries, but aside from a few minor bruises, she was relatively unharmed. This led Detective Mason to a chilling conclusion. What if Sarah hadn't been acting purely in self-defense? What if she had planned this all along? The detectives began to dig deeper into Sarah's life, searching for any signs that she had been plotting her stepfather's murder. They went through her phone, her emails, and her social media accounts, looking for any indication that she had confided in someone or left a trail of her intentions. What they found was both surprising and disturbing. Sarah had been messaging a close friend in the weeks leading up to John's death, expressing her fear of him and her desire to escape the abusive household. In one message, she wrote about how she felt like there was no way out, that John would never let her leave without a fight. But what alarmed the detectives most were the messages from the night before the murder. Sarah had told her friend that she was going to end things once and for all, that she couldn't live in fear any longer. It was clear that she had reached her breaking point. The detectives also found a series of online searches that raised even more suspicion. Sarah had been looking up information about self-defense laws, how to claim self-defense in court, and the legal consequences of killing someone in self-defense. While none of this was conclusive evidence of premeditation, it certainly cast doubt on Sarah's initial story. With this new information, Detective Mason confronted Sarah once again. This time she was more subdued, her previous confidence shaken. She admitted that she had been terrified of John, that he had abused her for years, but she still insisted that she hadn't planned to kill him. She claimed that things had escalated in a moment of panic, that she had only acted to protect herself when John attacked her. The case was becoming more complex with each passing day. The detectives were torn between seeing Sarah as a victim of abuse who had acted out of desperation and viewing her as a young woman who had taken matters into her own hands in a premeditated act of violence. The truth was somewhere in between, but uncovering it would require more than just piecing together evidence. They would need to understand Sarah's mindset and her true motivations on that fateful night. As the investigation entered its final stages, one question remained: was Sarah a victim, a murderer, or both? As Sarah's case moved into the courtroom, the community was divided. Some saw her as a victim, a young woman who had finally fought back after enduring years of torment at the hands of her stepfather. Others viewed her actions with suspicion, questioning whether it was truly self-defense or if she had planned the murder in cold blood. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense, with both sides presenting their arguments in front of the jury. The prosecution's case centered on the idea that Sarah had committed premeditated murder. They argued that her story of an intruder didn't hold up under scrutiny. There were no signs of forced entry into the house, and the wounds on John's body suggested that he hadn't been in a struggle for his life, but instead had been caught off guard. They brought forward the messages Sarah had sent to her friend, pointing out how she had expressed her desire to be free from John. The prosecutor painted a picture of a young woman who had grown tired of her stepfather's abuse and had finally snapped, choosing murder as her way out. The defense, however, focused on Sarah's traumatic history and the years of abuse she had suffered. They called witnesses who testified to John's violent temper and controlling nature. Laura, Sarah's mother, was one of the key witnesses for the defense. Through tears, she recounted the many times she had witnessed John's cruelty toward her daughter, admitting that she had failed to protect her. Laura's testimony was heartbreaking, painting a picture of a household filled with fear and tension. She told the court that Sarah had often confided in her about her fear of John, but that she had never imagined it would come to this. Sarah's attorney argued that she had acted in self-defense after years of being trapped in a nightmare. They emphasized that she had no other choice but to defend herself when John attacked her that night. They presented evidence of John's past abuse, including medical records that showed Sarah had been treated for injuries in the past, injuries that were consistent with domestic violence. The defense portrayed Sarah as a young woman pushed to her breaking point, forced to make a split-second decision to save her own life. As the trial progressed, the jury listened intently to both sides. The forensic evidence played a critical role in the case. The prosecution pointed out that the knife Sarah used to kill John had been pulled from a drawer, indicating she had taken the time to retrieve it during the struggle. This, they argued, suggested premeditation rather than an act of self-defense. The defense countered by saying that Sarah had grabbed the knife out of desperation, with no time to think, as she fought to survive. The courtroom was packed as both sides presented their closing arguments. The prosecution urged the jury to focus on the facts that Sarah's story about the intruder was a lie, and that her actions had been deliberate. They asked the jury to consider the messages she had sent to her friend and the online searches she had made about self-defense. To them, it was clear that Sarah had been planning her stepfather's murder for some time. The defense, however, pleaded with the jury to see Sarah as a victim, someone who had suffered unimaginable abuse at the hands of a man who was supposed to protect her. They pointed out the years of trauma she had endured and reminded the jury that people in abusive situations often make irrational decisions when faced with danger. They argued that Sarah's fear of John had driven her to act out of survival, not out of malice or premeditation. When it was finally time for the jury to deliberate, the entire courtroom held its breath. The media had been following the case closely, and everyone was eager to see what the verdict would be. It had been an emotional trial, with both sides presenting compelling arguments. The jury spent hours discussing the evidence, weighing the testimony of the witnesses, and trying to make sense of Sarah's actions on that fateful night. In the end, the jury had to decide one critical question: was Sarah guilty of premeditated murder, or had she acted in self-defense after years of enduring abuse? The evidence was complex, and the emotions surrounding the case were even more so. As the hours dragged on, it became clear that this was not going to be an easy decision for the jury to make. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the jury returned to the courtroom. Sarah sat silently, her hands trembling slightly as she waited for the verdict to be read. The judge asked the jury foreman to rise and deliver their decision. The courtroom was silent, everyone holding their breath in anticipation. As the foreman began to speak, Sarah's fate was sealed. The trial had been intense, with every piece of evidence dissected and analyzed by both the prosecution and defense. Sarah sat quietly each day, her face showing little emotion, as the weight of the courtroom scrutiny hung heavily on her shoulders. The prosecutor had done everything in their power to present her as a cold-blooded killer, while the defense had worked hard to paint her as a victim of years of abuse. The jury was faced with the difficult task of deciding whether Sarah had killed John in cold blood or in self-defense. The evidence was there, but it could be interpreted in different ways. The knife, pulled from the kitchen drawer, had been the focal point of much debate. Had Sarah grabbed it in a moment of desperation, or had she planned the attack? The prosecution leaned heavily on the fact that there had been no intruder, calling Sarah's story into question. The defense, on the other hand, focused on the years of trauma Sarah had endured, urging the jury to understand that her actions were the result of fear, not premeditation. Witnesses from both sides had taken the stand. Laura's emotional testimony about the years of abuse she had witnessed in their home had brought many in the courtroom to tears. She described how John had controlled every aspect of their lives, from what they could wear to when they could leave the house. Her voice shook as she admitted that she had failed to protect her daughter from his violence. The jury listened intently, clearly affected by her words, but the prosecution was quick to remind them that emotion should not overshadow the facts of the case. The prosecution had also called neighbors to the stand, hoping to cast doubt on Sarah's character. They brought forward people who claimed that Sarah had been seen arguing with John on more than one occasion, and that their relationship had always seemed volatile. They pointed to her internet searches about self-defense and her messages to a friend about wanting to escape as proof that she had planned the murder. These witnesses painted a picture of a troubled household, but it was still unclear to the jury whether Sarah had acted out of fear or anger. As the trial progressed, it became evident that the outcome was far from certain. The jury had been presented with two starkly different narratives, one of a young woman finally standing up to her abuser, and another of someone who had premeditated her stepfather's murder. The courtroom was packed each day, with members of the media reporting on every detail, adding to the tension surrounding the case. The defense had one final move before closing arguments. Sarah herself took the stand. It was a risky decision, but her lawyer believed it was necessary to let her explain her side of the story directly to the jury. As she sat in the witness box, she appeared calm, though her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. She recounted the night of the murder, her voice steady but filled with emotion. She described how John had cornered her in the kitchen, threatening her after she had refused to obey one of his demands. She told the jury how she had felt trapped, like there was no way out. She explained that when he grabbed her arm, she had panicked, and in her fear she had reached for the knife. She spoke about the years of abuse, the nights spent terrified of what John might do next, and the hopelessness that had consumed her. She maintained that she had not planned to kill him, that she had only wanted to protect herself. The courtroom was silent as Sarah spoke. Her testimony was gripping, and for the first time the jury saw not just a defendant, but a young woman who had been pushed to the edge. Her lawyer carefully guided her through the difficult questions, allowing her to tell her story without embellishment. When the prosecution cross-examined her, they tried to rattle her, pointing out inconsistencies in her account of the night in question. But Sarah remained composed, repeating that she had acted out of fear and desperation. As the trial neared its conclusion, both sides delivered their closing arguments. The prosecution reminded the jury that Sarah had lied about the intruder, that she had searched for information on self-defense, and that the knife had been pulled from a drawer during the altercation. They asked the jury to focus on the evidence, not the emotions, and to convict her of murder. The defense, however, asked the jury to consider the years of abuse that Sarah had endured, the fear that had driven her to take such drastic action. They emphasized that her story of abuse had been corroborated by medical records and witness testimony. They asked the jury to see Sarah as a victim, someone who had been forced into a situation where her survival instincts had taken over. The jury deliberated for hours, the weight of their decision heavy on their shoulders. The media waited outside the courthouse, eager for the verdict. Sarah sat in her cell, her future hanging in the balance, while her mother, Laura, waited anxiously nearby. The community was divided, with some believing that justice would only be served with a conviction, while others felt that Sarah had already suffered enough. As the jury filed back into the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Everyone held their breath as the foreman stood to deliver the verdict. As the jury delivered their verdict, the tension in the courtroom was unbearable. The foreman's voice was calm but firm as he read aloud the words everyone had been waiting to hear. Sarah held her breath, her mother's hand tightly gripping hers. The world outside the courthouse had come to a standstill, with reporters, onlookers, and community members gathered to hear the outcome. Sarah was found not guilty of murder, but the decision didn't come without conditions. The jury had accepted that Sarah had acted in self-defense, but they also believed she had been reckless in not calling for help sooner. Instead of a prison sentence for murder, Sarah would face mandatory counseling and probation. The ruling was a compromise that left neither side completely satisfied. The courtroom was silent for a moment as the weight of the decision sank in. Some members of the audience quietly applauded, while others looked on in disbelief. Laura broke down into tears, hugging her daughter tightly. The emotional toll of the trial had been immense for both of them, and while the ruling brought relief, it didn't erase the trauma of what had happened. John's family, who had been present throughout the trial, sat in stunned silence. They had pushed for a harsher punishment, refusing to believe that Sarah had acted in self-defense. Their belief that John had been a strict but caring man left them angry and disillusioned with the justice system. As they quietly left the courtroom, their grief and frustration were palpable, but there was nothing more they could do. For Sarah, the ruling marked the end of one battle, but the beginning of another. The legal case may have concluded, but the emotional scars of the events that led to her stepfather's death would take much longer to heal. She had been freed from the physical presence of her abuser, but the years of torment he had inflicted on her and her mother left deep psychological wounds. Laura, too, was left grappling with a complex mix of emotions. She had loved John once, and though she knew he had been cruel and violent, she struggled with the fact that his life had ended at her daughter's hands. The guilt weighed heavily on her, even though she knew Sarah had done what she had to do to survive. Together they would have to navigate their new reality, trying to rebuild their lives while haunted by the past. The community remained divided in the weeks and months that followed. Some saw Sarah as a victim who had finally stood up to her abuser, while others believed she had gotten away with murder. The media continued to cover the case long after the verdict, analyzing every aspect of the trial and its outcome. But as time passed, the attention began to fade, and Sarah and Laura were left to pick up the pieces of their lives in relative peace.